All right, so today we're going to be talking about some React stuff. As time goes on, like in the agency world and where I work and everything, we are, getting more and more into the realm of building React projects, and certainly React's been around much longer than recently. So we're just kind of now starting to get into it and really trying to set in place some processes and truly understand what it is that we're working with when we're working with the React framework and stuff. So part of what I'm doing here is certainly for me, doing these streams and stuff helps me understand core concepts that I normally wouldn't spend a whole lot of time trying to understand. But in the streaming world or teaching people world, when I kind of go through these things and talk about them at whatever level, whether it's a very basic intro to React type of thing like we're doing today or something much more complicated, talking about it to a stream or a recording is super helpful for me to really truly comprehend the subject. So that's kind of what I'm doing here today, is we're just gonna, at a very low-ish level, kind of dive into React stuff. I'm gonna talk about how to get started with a simple React application using Create React App. I'm gonna kind of go through how to install the Create React App NPM package. We're gonna look through the package.json, which is not anything super crazy, but just kind of explore what Create React App does when you run the command. We're going to go over some of the commands that you get built in through the package.json file, what those commands mean, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about too what actually happens when you run Create React App. What does it set up for you? What does it do really well? And then also where does Create React App kind of fall short for a full-on production application? So if you are looking to use React to build a production level web application or something like that, there's definitely some things that you should know about Create React App that you may want to take into consideration for your full-fledged app. So that type of stuff. And then honestly, depending on how long that goes, I don't want this to be super overwhelming and super long or anything like that. But depending on how long that goes, we will also kind of go through some entry-level React concepts, some basic structuring of the application as far as folder structure, that type of stuff. And then also the different types of components, the more common types of components that you'll encounter when you start building a React application. So we'll go through that, and I'll kind of explain the use cases for some of the various types of React components. But for now, I guess we'll kind of just get started. Let's go ahead. And so the first thing that we need to do is, I've been talking about Create React App. Create React App is a little NPM script that Facebook put out that essentially allows you, it's like a boilerplate setup for a React application. So it handles a few of the more annoying steps that you would have to go through manually. As I've gone through this and as I've kind of spun up a few of my own little React applications and stuff, the most annoying thing that I've run into is how to get started even. So there are always a ton of dependencies that React itself relies on, or you read a how-to tutorial on how to spin up a React app, and that how-to tutorial is oh, well, you're going to want to use Redux, and you're going to want to figure out routing, and you're going to want to do this and that. There are a lot of convoluted instructions on how to set up a React app, and a lot of them are super opinionated too. So what Create React App strives to do is kind of remove the complexities, the opinionation out of a lot of that, and makes it fairly easy for you to just kind of get up and running and acquaint yourself with React. At a lower level, so that you can kind of understand the core concepts and stuff, and you can start messing around with things and figure out for yourself whether you need Redux, whether you want to figure out some more complex routing, if you want to do server-side rendering, that type of stuff. So before I get like too super far into this, I'm kind of assuming that if you're watching this, you have at least a little bit of knowledge about how React works. I've played with it a little bit myself. I've read all those fairly annoying opinionated tutorials about how to set up a React app. So some of the things that I talk about may be, if you've never worked with React like at all before, some of the things that I talk about may be a little bit confusing to you, but feel free, throw in the chat or the comments or whatever questions that you have as I'm going through this, and I'll be happy to answer them as soon as I can get to them. So create React app. Facebook put it out. It's just an npm package that you can install globally on your local machine. So on the right hand side of the screen here, I've got my terminal open, and I've already got this installed on my local machine, but it's super easy to get installed on your computer. If we go to, they don't have installation instructions on their readmes, do they? Either way, the command to install create React app, npm install, and then the G flag for global, and then it's just create React app. If I run that, it should tell me that I already have it installed, but it looks like it updated it for me. Cool. So once you run that, it'll install globally the create React app command for you. I'm going to go into my example directory here. Cool. So I've got a fresh workspace here. I've got one project in here that was just me messing around with create React app before this stream, but we'll go ahead and create a new React app. All you need to do is, once you're in the directory that you want to create your new project within, all you need to do is run create React app, and I'll call this React starter. So this is going to run through and install a fair amount of well, actually, no, in the package.json, there's not too many dependencies or anything, but you'll see up towards the top, and let me blow that up a little bit. Up towards the top, you'll see it's installing React, React DOM, and then React scripts. And what React scripts is essentially just a package of scripts that React requires to use. So it's essentially like dependencies for this base level React application. They use Yarn, which is just something that they've decided to use as a package manager. That's fine. I like to use NPM myself. So as we're going through this this overview, I'm going to be running NPM scripts or NPM commands rather than the Yarn commands. They do exactly the same thing, so nothing crazy there. So once that's all done, you'll see, if I do an ls, the create React app command has created a new directory for me called React starter. If we go into React starter, I'm just going to open that up so that we can look at the file structure. Well, that's incorrect. I did this literally like 45 minutes ago, and of course, as soon as I like spin up the stream and start trying to do it, it's not gonna it's not gonna output the right files. An unexpected error occurred. Oh well, that's why. No such file or directory. Interesting. Let's try this one more time. I don't imagine that I would have to like sudo for it, right? I didn't have to last time. Npm create React. app. No. I guess we'll follow the docs exactly as they are outlined to us and use npx. Now, it seems like this is taking a little bit longer than it did last time. It didn't error out, so that's good. And as I said, too, definitely, if you're watching this, like I said, as I'm going through, if you have literally any question at all, I'm happy to tackle it. Just drop it in the chat or whatever. I'm happy to diverge a little bit from what it is I'm doing exactly to try to help. So what in the world? Such file or directory. Oh my goodness. This live coding is, you do something one time and it works perfectly, and as soon as you try to do a professional video, things break. Is it just going to be the yarn error log? Okay, so rm rf react starter. I'm on Windows. I know it's very frustrating for a lot of people to tell them that I'm on Windows, but let me try and run this through PowerShell, because sometimes WSL does not like npm commands. So let's just try it outside. And actually, I need to run PowerShell as an administrator. Go into my D drive, workspace stream. Cool. If I do create React app, React starter, npx, is that a thing? Okay, px create React app, React starter. Maybe it'll work through PowerShell. Let's find out. Resolving packages, fetching packages. At least when I mess things up like this, you can see that, like, I don't know about you, but anytime I watch like a YouTube video, or like I read a tutorial about how people have set this up, they don't screw up ever. So if anything, at least you see that I'm a human, and I break things all the time. Even when I did them literally like an hour ago, I still find a way to break it. So there we go. That looks better. Oh, I'm going to get out of PowerShell because nobody likes PowerShell. And I will cd into React Starter. Terrific. That actually gives us folders, files, some real stuff. So now I'll open up this project in a new window so that we can look at the file structure and everything. And give me just 1 second here. Cool. Okay, so we've installed create React app as a global npm command. I had to do it through PowerShell apparently, and not through WSL. So if you're on a Windows machine, keep that in mind, that sometimes WSL does not like npm commands like that. So noted. In the next step, what I wanted to do here is just kind of look over the oops, sorry about that. Look over the package.json. Anytime you're working with a JavaScript application that has a bunch of like JavaScript dependencies and all of that type of stuff, if you're working with npm as a package manager as well, you're going to have a package.json. So the first thing that I want to do is just kind of look through this and get an understanding of what it is that create React app is actually doing. So as we saw in the command that we were running, create React app installs a few of your node dependencies and stuff like that. It's installed React, the latest version 16.7, React DOM 16.7 as well. And then these React scripts, which, like I said, are just dependencies of React and Create React App. Create React App does make some decisions for us as far as like the actual dependencies that are needed, but they have packaged those dependencies up into one dependency itself so that your package.json file isn't necessarily crowded with a whole bunch of dependencies that you don't understand what they're doing. This is kind of one of those things. You're using a Facebook product. You kind of have to trust that Facebook has, which is a weird thing to say, trust Facebook, but the technology side is solid, and they've, packaged up the dependencies that you need for a fairly zero configuration type of React application. So package.json isn't muddied up with a whole bunch of crazy stuff. So it's a nice kind of added bonus. You have a nice clean package.json. There's not a whole bunch of crazy stuff in here that you're questioning what it's doing and all of that type of stuff, which helps a lot. In the past, I'm not sure which version changed, but they used to dump all of the dependencies within the package.json, and this would get super convoluted and confusing. So it's a good change for them to just essentially add this React scripts dependencies that then loads other dependencies. Because if we were, I bet you, if we were to go into the actual node modules, you can see that there are a ton of other dependencies that get installed. A lot of these would have been dumped in the package.json, but with React scripts, they're not. So good to know. Create React App itself, it takes a lot of headache out of setting up one of these by yourself. Like I said towards the beginning, if you were rolling like your own Webpack config and trying to figure out all the dependencies that you needed to get React and React DOM and everything to work and routing and all of that type of stuff, it would be a fairly big pain. I've tried to roll my own Webpack config multiple times, and every single time, no matter how hard I tried like to fully comprehend what I'm doing, I end up just copying and pasting from Stack Overflow in hopes that my Webpack config ends up working. So Create React App takes a lot of the headache out of that for sure. This Create React App also sets up, when you're building a React app, you use JSX. It sets up Babel for you to be able to write ES6. It does. It handles a lot of the transpiling and all of that type of stuff for you. So really solid way to just get you up and running really quickly. So going back to the package.json, let's look at the scripts here. So out of the box, you get a few Npm commands that you can run to start your app. We'll just kind of go down the list here. So Npm Run Start. If you were to run that command, it's going to run a React script start, which is a function within that React scripts package. Fairly self-explanatory. This just starts a development server for you and will allow you to view the application as it is. It allows you to, when you save various files within your React application, it'll refresh the page automatically to show you those changes. So this essentially just starts up a development server for you. Npm Run Build just bundles the application into static files. Generally, you would run this right before you push your code up to a production server, and that way you just have you're serving static files. That certainly changes if you're doing a server-side rendered application, but that is way out of the scope of this video. So we'll just keep moving on. Build static files for you. Npm Run Tests starts a test runner and lets you test your application. This is one of the opinionated things that Create React App does. When you're running tests, you're using Jest, which is another Facebook product, I believe. Jest is just a testing library. We can look at it real quick, just get a quick overview of it. So yeah, it's just JavaScript testing integrated in with your React application. depending on what you want to do, if you're the type of person who enjoys test-driven development, that's great. You've got testing out of the box. You can use it. Otherwise, testing is definitely something to educate yourself on and try to establish whether or not you need it. I think the best advice about testing is just be smart about what you need to test. I think 100% test code coverage is a little bit of a ridiculous metric, because then you're just writing tests for the sake of writing tests. But really think about whether or not your component is something that needs a test written for it. If it'll save you a headache down the future or down the line, then writing a quick, simple test to accompany your component or whatever is probably a good idea. Won't be going through any testing stuff through this video. That's definitely like a video in itself, but you've got that built in for the future. You can mess around with it here. The last command that you can run is eject, and I've never run this before, but I've read up on it a little bit. When you run this command, it essentially takes your app out of the create React app like setup. So all of these opinionations, I don't even know if that's a word, all these opinions that they've decided to build into create React app, it will allow you to separate from some of those decisions, and it'll let you customize your like project configuration. You can roll your own Webpack config and stuff like that if you want. If you run this, it's not reversible though. So if you want to just mess around with it and see what it does and try to roll your own, then you can start up a new project, make sure you back everything up or whatever. But yeah, this is kind of like the big red button that if you push it, there's no turning back from. So four commands, fairly simple. What we'll do now, just so you can see what we're working with, is just do npm run start. Fingers crossed that this actually starts correctly on the first try, and I don't have to do 3 different things to get it to work. It starts up the development server. It should kick off a few more things here. Cool, and then once it's done, it gives you a couple of links that you can look on your local machine using localhost. Just drag that over here. And we're up and running already with a super low-level React application. I try to avoid using the word basic just because nothing is basic anymore, but the app itself is fairly basic, for lack of a better word. So we're up and running with a React application. If we were to change something here, if we say don't edit, save that, it should automatically refresh. You see your changes on the page. That's awesome. You will notice, and if you've looked into React at all, that the page refreshed, so that means that there is no hot module reloading or HMR built into create React app. That's a separate deal. So create React app by itself just listens for changes to files and then re-renders the application once it's done compiling. Give me 1 second. I'm going to go grab some more water. I'll be right back. Cool. So we're up and running with a basic React app. Let's just kind of go through some of these files a little bit that it's generated for us. Let me blow that up just a little bit. So anytime you create a React application, there's generally a few things that need to happen. You need to attach your application to a DOM element on the page. That's usually done in the index.js file. Again, I'm assuming that there's a little bit of background knowledge on your end of React here. So I'm not going to go over this too much in depth, but Create React App generates this index file for you. It imports React and React DOM and then some CSS associated with this little landing page. It also imports the app.js component, which is what we were just on. And then in order for it to claim itself to be a web app, it registers a server worker for you. That's what this note here is saying. If you want your app to work offline and load faster, you can change unregistered to register, and it'll register the service worker for you. And by virtue of having a service worker, it'll move you one step closer to a PWA. So Create React App generates all this. It attaches your whole application component to the root of the document. I have React DevTools installed on my browser here, so you can see that the app component is rendered here. If we go on the in the inspector for the actual DOM, you'll see that the root of the project is just right underneath the body. So it gets the root element and just spits out your application there. So it kind of hooks all of this stuff up for you initially, which is nice. So that's all that index does there. We can look at the app.js file real quick, and this is just standard JSX stuff. There's no props or anything crazy being passed down to this stuff yet, but that's good. We just want this to be very, very basic. So you can delete this, change it up however you want. I'm just going to leave it on there so that there's at least a little something to look at while we're going through this other stuff. Cool. Okay, so we've gone through the app.js, we've gone through index.js. There are a couple of things that are worth talking about before we get into talking about like components and component types and stuff. There are a couple of things that I've mentioned already that Create React App kind of falls a little bit short when you're trying to actually build like a full-fledged production level application. So like I mentioned, there's no HMR, hot module reloading out of the box. That's not like a deal breaker for a production app or anything, but like as you're developing a React application, having hot module reloading is super helpful, because once you get into passing data around between components and all of that type of stuff, you generally want your application to retain state in certain places. So if you had like a bunch of form fields on your application that had values associated with them in the local state of that component, and you were to, change something on this page, hit save, hot module reloading would retain all of that state and only reload the component that you're working within. As long as you're only doing like JSX changes or CSS changes and stuff like that, it wouldn't refresh the whole page. It would just refresh the single component that you're working with. So as we see the loading bar come up and everything and the page flash a little bit, that's an indication that it's not doing hot module reloading. So a little bit of an annoyance there while you're developing, if you're developing a full scale like application, something to keep in mind. In addition to that, Create React App out of the box does not handle things like server-side rendering. As you go further into your adventures with React and actually like wanting to, as you want to actually like push out a production level application, server-side rendering, things like middleware routing, all of these like state management, things like Redux or Next.js or Apollo, GraphQL, those types of like buzzwords, you're going to need to kind of like sit down and assess what your application needs and figure out where to go. Create React App gives you a really good starting point for those things, but it does not handle those things out of the box. So that's kind of where it falls short from a production app type of standpoint. And in addition to another like beneficial performance thing that you can do with React or JavaScript applications is code splitting. So like things like CSS modules are helpful during development and add to performance and stuff on the front end once you actually deploy your application. So it's something to keep in mind that Create React App just out of the box does not handle. So cool. So now we're just going to move on to just a couple of like general best practices for a React app that once you do get into that production level application, you can kind of carry these things over, and hopefully it'll set you up for success in the future. One of the things that I'm really like in my head about is just like the folder structure of a project and stuff like that. So figure I'd share with you kind of how I like to structure my components and stuff at a low level. Within the application, so Create React App just dumps everything into this src folder, the source folder. I like to compartmentalize things a little bit more. So if I'm building an app, usually what I like to do is add a folder that's something like components, and you can certainly kind of take this approach and mold it to match your own. This isn't anything like groundbreaking, but I like to split everything out into components. At the top level, I would move like this global app component just into components straight up. That's going to break everything, obviously, because I need to update the reference to the file. Module not found, cannot resolve logo. Oh, right, that's because we're in a folder now, so we need to go up one. There we go. So these higher level kind of global components, I will just drop into the components folder. As you go deeper and deeper into, having dozens and dozens of components, what I generally like to do is just add a folder for each component and then keep the CSS and the JavaScript for that component in one file, in one folder. So down the line here, we are going to be creating just a test component so that I can show you the different types of components that are associated with the React application and when to use them and how to write them out and stuff like that. So what I'll do is I'll just add like a welcome component, or actually I'm just going to call it test. It's easier. So it's just a test folder that eventually will have a test.js for our component to write JSX in, and then down the line, if you wanted, test.css, and then you could reference the CSS file right within that component. So as you get dozens and dozens of components, you'll have a folder for each one, and that makes it, I don't know about you, but like that makes it feel a lot more web component-y, which I think is something a lot of front-end devs have dreamed about for eons. Like web components are something that it just makes a lot of sense, keeping things really compartmentalized and grouped really well. Having the CSS file associated with the HTML file, the JSX file, whatever ends up being, just feels good, I think, to a lot of people. So that's the method I employ. If something else works better for you, that's great. You as long as you're consistent, then there's nothing wrong with that at all. So cool. We've set up a little folder structure. Things get a little bit more complex, I guess, as you add CSS modules and stuff, but the principle stays the same. When you do CSS modules, essentially what is happening is you have a CSS file that is associated directly with your Java or your React component. And this little folder structure here mimics that pretty well. And the nice thing about CSS modules, if you're not familiar with them, is that when you import your component, say this test component that we're going to build here in a minute, if you load that component on a page, the CSS associated with that component is only loaded on the page that component exists. So like, as we're going through, React is a single page application type of deal, right? You can add routing and stuff like that, but essentially what's just happening is on the page, JavaScript is replacing DOM elements with other DOM elements at a really low level, right? So with CSS modules, the nice thing is that you're not having to load all of your CSS associated with all of your components on every single page. Rather, you're only loading the CSS for that component when that component is used. So it makes a lot of sense from a performance standpoint. You're not loading a giant chunk of CSS for no reason. So as you go through and on your journey to building a full-fledged React application for production, CSS modules are something that you may consider looking into. So I'll leave it at that. That'll probably be a topic for another time, but we'll move on for now. So the basis of any React application is components. Everything in React, for the most part, is components and methods and JavaScript functions that tell your components to do things. So what we'll do here is we're just going to, for now, build out a really non-complicated component. There are not many, but there are quite a few different React component types. I'm only going to go over a few of them because this video would be like 6 hours long if we were to talk about all of them and their intricacies and stuff. But the major ones that you're likely to run into and that you'll likely want to use, especially starting out with a React application, are stateless functional components, just normal class components, and pure components, and then higher order components as well. But I'm just going to kind of brush over that a little bit because that's a bit of a rabbit hole to dive down to. So what I'm going to do here is just start with a super basic stateless functional component. A stateless functional component is essentially, it's more or less self-explanatory. It's just a function which can but doesn't have to take in props as an argument, and then it returns a React element. So we'll just write something super simple here for now. Because we are using React. Well, hold on, this is actually a question for myself anyway. So let's just try this. Let's see what happens, right? So I want to write a stateless functional component. I have no state. I'm not necessarily at this particular moment passing any props or any data or anything down to this component. I just want a component that outputs welcome on the page, right? So I'm going to add a const that is state. Well, I'm just going to call it test for now since that's the name of our component. Equals, and then I'm just going to do an ES6 arrow function here. And I'm going to implicitly return a div that says test. And now, if I want to gain access to this component from, say, my app.js file, and let me close out some of these other ones just so we're only working with 2 files. If I want to get at this component here, we essentially just need to export that component, right? So export test. Anthony, I see you follow. Thanks, dude. Thanks for the follow. So we need to export default test. Okay, cool. So that answers my question. I didn't know if I had to import React for a stateless functional component, but generally for any React component, because we're using React, you need to import React from React at the top of your file. And that's a capital R, I believe. Cool. So no error is there. If I save that, nothing's going to happen because we are not referencing test in our app.js. So we've exported test as a component. within app.js, we should now be able to get at that component, right? So if I wanted to just output our test component above the header, I should be able to do that. But don't forget that you need to import that so your app.js file knows that test.js exists. So you just import test and make sure that whatever you're importing is the same name as whatever you've exported. So import test from, and then the file path is just components. No, we're in components. It's going to be test/test. I can see how some people might not like that folder structure. I don't know if maybe it makes more sense to like lowercase this t. That's like a semantics thing or whatever. But I'm just this is just how I like to import my components. So cool. I've imported it. I've put it above the header, and now you can see test exists on top of the application. If we were to change this to super cool test, save it, it'll refresh the page and the text updates. So at the lowest level, like this is it. You've created a React component, you're off and running. That's awesome. You can, so what a stateless functional component means then is that there is no localized state within this component, right? You're not using this component to update a username or add an age or something like that. This stateless functional component is more or less just a display component. You can pass data to this component, and I'll show you how to do that here in a sec, but no methods or anything crazy can be run on a stateless functional component. You don't get access to the lifecycle methods of React. You can't do component did mount or will mount or any of that type of stuff. Stateless functional components are essentially just display components. So let's look at how to pass data to this component. So if we were building like a dashboard page for a user, right? You could say that you would want this dashboard component to say hello name. Whoever is logged in, the name will output here. You can pass props to your component wherever you're referencing that component. In our case, the app.js file. You can add a parameter here or a prop here that is name equals DOM. You won't have, so we've attached this prop to this component. And if you were to look in the React dev tools, that is super tiny, so I'm sure nobody can see that. Either way, in this little sidebar here, you'll see that we now have access to props, name, DOM. If you've worked with React at all, if you have any experience looking at how React works, you'll kind of understand the concept of props and all of that. So we've passed data down to our test component. In order to get at that data, we need to make our component aware of that data. So within our stateless functional component, we can pass props as an argument to our component. So within our arrow function here, we can remove the parentheses since there's only going to be one argument passed here, props. We now have access to props, which we passed down through app. We can now, within our little JSX curly brackets here, do props.name. And there you go. You have access now to props that you have passed down to your component. So stateless functional components can take in props, take in data, and use that data, display that data. Like I said, just a display component. Visual doesn't do anything with that data other than display it. One thing that I like to do, and this is like an ES6 practice, is just I like to destructure as much as I can. So instead of, if we were to pass like a ton of stuff, a ton of props down to our test component, if I had like an age equals 28 and a height equals, whatever, 6 foot. instead of having to type props.name, props.age, props.height, I like to destructure that as much as possible. So instead of just passing down all props, you can destructure that by doing the curly braces, or sorry, the parentheses, and then adding curly braces, which is the indication that we are destructuring something. And by default, React will understand that you're destructuring props here when you pass data down to it like this. So, well, fingers crossed. Let's see if this works, right? Name, age, height. So then instead of saying props.name, we have destructured that. We can say name. Hello, name. You are age and height, tall. And there you go. So we've destructured the props so that we don't have to continuously do props dot whatever, and we now have access to all of the props that we've passed down. The one potential downside to this, and I'm not sure if it's even really a downside, is that you do have to be explicit in telling your component what props you're trying to destructure, right? It needs to be aware of those things. So as you add more things, as you add more props to your component, you'll need to add more definitions of those props to your destructuring function here. So something to keep in mind, but I like to destructure pretty much wherever I can. Cool. And you'll notice too, I have Prettier installed on my VS Code, and that's just an extension that formats your code in a set way. So when I saved that, here, I'll go back a couple. Because this line got super long, Prettier decided that it hit some sort of point where it needed to add, instead of implicitly returning it, we're now defining the return through these parentheses. So it just put it on a new line, added the parentheses, and then added some nicer spacing. Cool. So that's more or less just a higher overview of what a stateless functional component does. You've got access to props if you pass down data. If you were to be using, if you've gotten super into React and you're like, oh, what about like context and all of that type of stuff, you can pass down props and context. You can pass whatever data down to this component that you need to through the arrow function. So as long as you define it, you should be good to go. Cool. So that is stateless functional components. These are, how am I trying to say this? You run into these a lot, certainly, but I think the most common use case or the most common type of component that you'll at least initially run into is a class component. So in React and in ES6, you can define a class that extends something. And within React, you have a few different options. One of those options is component. So if we wanted to start to, if you wanted to start adding local state to a component, if you wanted to create methods within this component that allow the user to change their age and change their height or adjust their name or do anything like that, a class component is what you'll need. And my little puppy is whining and she needs outside, so sorry, I need to step away real quick. Give me one more second. All right, sorry about that. Class components. So when you get to the point where you actually want to start adding some reactiveness to your application, allow a user to adjust name, age, height, anything, actually start interacting with your app, you move into class component territory. So let's just see how that is added. So within React, in addition to importing React from React, you can also import various different specific chunks, features within React. One of those features is component. This just gets React to understand that you're creating a component. It makes it understand the lifecycle methods. It makes it understand that you're going to be doing stuff with state and all of that type of stuff. So importing component from React just gives you access to all the goodness that comes with a React component. So what we need to do then is essentially convert this from a stateless functional component into a class component. So we've imported component. React knows that the component is there. We then write class test extends component. It used to be such that you would have, it didn't used to be, you can still do it this way. If you, for whatever reason, don't feel like adding this extra bit of text to your import, you can also say, hey, class test extends React, React dot component. This is just another way of getting at a feature set, a method within React, right? Because I like to destructure absolutely everything, I've destructured component out from React so that I don't have to do React dot. Personal preference, not a big deal if you have different preferences. Cool, so we've got that going. We've defined test as a component, and now there are a couple of things within a component that needs to happen. We down here initially returned the div with the hello and everything in the context and the content within it. We need to tell the component what to render. So two things that needs to be in every single component is a render method. I cannot type to save my life. Render. That tells this component what we are rendering, and then in order to actually output the JSX, you need to tell it to return the JSX. So it's a little bit more of a verbose syntax to just straight up get at some text. And because I haven't passed any props or anything to our class component yet, I'm just going to comment that out. And I'm going to comment out that and say hello for now. We are already exporting default test. It's the same deal. You just export the default method that you want to your app.js to get at. So you can save that. Changes it to just hello. We've created at the very basic level a class component. You do still have access to those props. So in a different way, to get at them, you just have to do this .props.name. Hello, Dom. This within React is a little bit weird. React plus ES6 weirdness with this makes it a little bit of a complicated subject that honestly I don't even fully comprehend, but I just follow what the React docs and everything say. And this, at this particular point, is referencing this component by itself. When you start adding methods and things to this component where you're, setting state and doing things like that, unless you bind this is not this. So it's hard to explain and a weird concept, but in order to reference the props, at least at this level, terrible pun. At this level, you have to do this .props.name. This is something that we can destructure. If we wanted to, we could do it up here. I'm going to end up doing it in a different place down the line here, but just for example's sake, we can run const, and then we do essentially the same thing that we did here when we destructured props within test, or sorry, within our stateless functional component. So we do const name, age, and height equals this dot props. So we've taken this dot props, we've destructured name, age, and height. So now we don't have to type this dot props every time. So now we've got hello, and we can essentially just comment that back in, and things should be working exactly like they were with our stateless functional component, which is terrific. The only reason, as I said towards the beginning here, the only reason that you would need to convert your stateless functional component to a full-blown React component is just if this component is going to have some sort of internal state. We're going to add a little bit of code here to allow people to I'm going to add an input field where we can change the age and allow you to actually do something a little bit reactive with this component. So that's why we changed it to a component class. Let me just double check and make sure I covered everything that I wanted to. Okay, so before we actually get into the methods and everything, I'm going to talk about the third type of component, which is pure component. So a pure component is a little bit of a different concept, and pure component offers some performance benefits to your application that you definitely want to consider, but you really want to be careful and don't overuse it, because there are absolutely places where if you use a pure component where you shouldn't be using a pure component, you can actually deteriorate the efficiency of your application. So pure components are something to consider when you're writing any component, but you do need to be specific about where you use them. So what we have here right now is actually a pretty decent candidate for pure component, and I'll explain why. Pure components are they're really similar to normal components, but pure components handle some lifecycle methods and stuff a little bit differently than a normal class component. So the normal class component doesn't handle the should component update lifecycle method as efficiently or as easily as a pure component does. Pure components allow us essentially to do like a shallow prop and state comparison. So the efficiency that you get with a pure component is only shown. So like, okay, take this example, right? So say you have a component on the page that when you navigate to another page needs to be updated, or once something happens when a user takes an action, that component essentially needs to re-render absolutely everything within itself, right? With a pure component, it does that shallow comparison to see if the data that you have passed to this pure component has changed. And if it has changed, then it'll re-render. But if nothing has changed, then there's no point for it to re-render, therefore giving you a little bit of a performance benefit. There are definitely some other technical things that, again, I'm not a like super React crazy expert or anything. There are other things that pure component does, but at high level, as far as I understand it, a pure component has that benefit. That benefit is one of its greatest strengths in that it detects the right time to re-render the entire component. So when you are building a fairly complex component that has a lot of data being passed to it, or if that data is complex, that's one thing that I learned fairly recently, is if the data being passed to a pure component is sufficiently complex, like if it isn't just basic strings and numbers and really, really basic objects, if you're being passed like functions or arrays and crazy stuff like that, a pure component loses its efficiency. So going back to just a normal component in those more complex cases is generally a good idea. That's probably a little bit more of like a deeper concept than is super necessary for this video, but it's worth at least bringing up and exploring, figuring out together, because like I said, I learn when I do these things too. So if someone out there knows more about pure components than I do, definitely correct me if I am wrong, because I'm still also learning these things. So, but moving forward, what we have written here is a decent candidate for a pure component, because all we're passing it is just strings and numbers, right? So in the same way that we destructured the component method from React, we can also do pure component. It's as simple as that. Like that. You're now writing a pure component instead of a full-blown component. We're still going to have state changes and methods within this component. It is now, because of the simplicity of this particular component, it's now just more efficient. So there you go. That's what a pure component does. If you've got questions about a pure component, I'm happy to hear them. I'm happy to try and answer them. I still, am learning about them myself and their intricacies. So there you go. Cool. So we got the pure component. We've still got access to the props and all of that type of stuff. Nothing has changed. Cool. Everything's working. Great job. Okay, cool. So just make sure, looking at my notes, covered everything about pure components that I wanted to talk about. Sweet. So now we can kind of move on to the fun reactive piece of React, right? So we now want to let people be able to adjust their age or change their name or adjust their height. I'm only going to do one of these things for now. I might as well just here. I'm going to just remove these props so that we're not looking at anything that we're not going to be using. Just going to be using age, or sorry, name. And I'm going to change this from a div to an h1 so it's a little bigger so we can see what's going on here. Okay. So now let's add some methods and some state. When you're working with components and you want to add localized state to this component, the first thing that you need to do is add a constructor method at the top of your component. Constructor. This constructor method is what is run before the component is mounted. So before anything happens on the page, your constructor method runs. It sets initial state if you define a string within the state, which we'll do here in a second. It defines the state. It binds any methods within your component. This is where you would, which we're going to do here in a minute, you would define your refs, which is another concept in React that I will talk about here in a second. This is kind of just the setup for your component. That being said, In order for you to then have access to props within your constructor, you need to pass props into your constructor. We, for our purposes, will not need props within our constructor, but if there are methods or things that need to happen to your props before the component mounts, this is where you would handle it. Same goes for your methods. So when you actually start writing methods within this component and you want to get at props, you want to pass, you essentially, this constructor method defines those props or lets you have access to them. So we've passed props in here. There's another little function that we need to run, super props. Do those two things, you'll have access to your props. In addition to that, we want to set some initial state on our component. So before anything renders, we want this component to set our age. I'll end up adding age back, but we want this component to set our age. So this dot set state, or sorry, we don't need to set state. This dot state. We are defining the state, the localized state of this component. That is just an object that you can then define anything within here that you want. So because I said age, we'll do age. Age by default is just going to be my age, 28. This component, if I save it, is broken. What did I do? Super is only valid inside a class constructor. Make sure the method name is spelled exactly as constructor. I don't know how to spell, folks. Constructor. There we go. Okay. Again, you're probably not going to be able to see this super well, but if I go to my React Dev Tools, I click on our test component, we now are looking at state. This component has its own localized state. So the data for this particular component, you can translate this to your own project however that makes sense, but this component is the only component that needs to know about my age because I'm only displaying my age once, right? So instead of props, we're going to be trying to get at state to display my age. You are age. That's the end product. That's what we want. How are we going to do that? By destructuring state. So const age. This dot state. Oh man, my sausage fingers are killing me right now. Just fat fingering everything. Jeez. All right. So we've defined another const that is the destructured age from this dot state. We now have access to that localized state, and we're outputting it in our return. Easy. Cool. We have state. Now, sorry, just double checking something. Perfect. So we've set state. We have a localized state within this component. Now, if we wanted to give the user the ability to change that number to interact with this application a little bit more, we can then start writing our own method. So change, or let's call it update age. We're going to write a new method that allows the user to hit an input field, hit a button. Once they hit that button, their age changes based on the number that they have put in the input field. I'm just going through this as a super, as a hopefully straightforward example of how you can at least just get started writing basic components and stuff within React. So it's fairly, yeah, these aren't the most like complex, intricate examples or anything crazy, but it's super important, for me to fully comprehend the the basics of a React app, and hopefully it ends up helping you at least learn a little bit about how to navigate around a React project after you've done some initial research and stuff. So figured I'd just throw that out there. Anyway, so we're going to write a way for that user to update their age. First thing that we're going to need is an input field that user can interact with. So when you're working with a React component, when you return something, React can only return one top level component, right? So as you see here, I have an H1 that is the top level element. Element is the word I was looking for. It can only return one single element. That element can have as many children or grandchildren, whatever, as you want. It can be as nested as you need, but it can't have adjacent elements. So like if I wanted to then add an input to this, input type equals number, and do that, we'll save it and we'll just see the error that we get. So if you try to compile that, you get a parsing error saying adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. Got it. So we need a wrapping element for these two adjacent JSX elements. So just for simplicity's sake, I will just do a div. Oops. That error also gives you a recommendation or a recommendation for a JSX fragment. Fragments are something newish, fairly newish, but you can, if for whatever reason in your markup, you don't need a wrapping div for like a reference. So like because this div is empty, it doesn't have a class name of, whatever, intro or test or whatever. There is no class name associated with this div in particular. I'm not targeting this div for styling. I don't need a class name or an ID on it for JavaScript targeting, anything like that. It's an empty div. You can use a fragment and it will not wrap the child elements. It will not wrap it in anything. So we can see what that looks like. A fragment is just an open and close bracket and then an open and close bracket with a slash, just like a normal HTML element, but with nothing inside of it. So we can do that, and you can see, maybe you can see, it's really tiny. I can't blow up the inspector font size easily. Oh, wait, there it goes. Terrific. So you'll see there's nothing wrapping these. Just for the visual, I'll put it back to a div so you can see that inside of our app, we now have div class test, and then our elements are within it. So useful little thing. Doesn't muddy up your markup with a whole bunch of empty divs if you're not targeting them. Makes it nice and easy to keep things a little bit clean. So I'm going to move that back to a fragment. And terrific. We have app with an H1 and an input right inside of there. Cool. So moving back into our method, I have an input. I want the user to be able to put their age into that input, hit a button, and then update their age. So we will also need a button that just says update age. Wonderful. Click that button, nothing happens. We need to attach an event to that button. And we do that through the use of onClick. This is a React JSX attribute that you can apply to almost anything, a lot of stuff, usually buttons, that tells it, hey, when a user clicks on this button, perform an action, run a method, do whatever. In this case, we want it to run a method. So on click, we're going to tell it to run. And because of the way that the keyword this works in React, we need to reference this .update age to get at the method that we've written up here. So this .update age. And I think we actually don't need the parentheses here because we're not passing any variables or anything to it. So it's just going to do this .update age. And just to show that that is working, let's say console.log update me console. Hit the button, we get the console log. So the onClick handler is working. It's referencing the correct method, and we're up and running with some interactivity. So cool stuff there. Perfect. So now when we hit that update button, what we want to do is update state, right? So updating state is done through a function called setState. That is a React function that works some magic to essentially override the state that you have set on your component here, override the localized state. So when we hit update age, we want to run this .set state. And when you run set state, you can pass it an object. And that object, you define the key that you want to target, which in our case is age, and then you tell it what you want to replace the existing state with in the context of your method. So that's a good question here, right? So how do we then get at the value of this input? Through like normal JavaScript, you would probably do something like this. You would set a const that is age input val, we'll just call it. And you would end up doing something like document.query selector or get element by ID, or one of those normal JavaScript types of methods to get at a DOM element on the page, get its value, whatever element by ID thing dot value, and you would have it within not node value, just value. Thank you. Within React, there are things called refs, and a ref is the proper way to reference a DOM element on the page. There are a ton of complexities in React when you're trying to get at, especially in production level applications and stuff, when you're trying to get at a DOM element on the page, it's entirely possible that that DOM element hasn't been rendered yet. If you're working with server-side rendering, that element may not exist by the time that this method is run, and there are a ton of complexities when referencing DOM elements on the page. So the proper way and the generally safe way to get at those DOM elements on the page is through use of a ref. So in order to set up a ref, you first have to define it, like I said before, within your constructor. So before the component is rendered on the page, we're essentially telling React, hey, we have a reference on this page to a DOM element, so just, do what you got to do to make sure that that DOM element is available for us. So in order to do that, up in your constructor, we just do this dot, I'm just going to call it age ref. You can name this ref anything you want. It doesn't have to end in ref. It can just be this dot age or this dot text or whatever you want it to be. I like to define all of my refs with ref at the end so that I know it's a ref. So this dot age ref equals React. So we're just running another function from React dot create ref. So we've told React to create a ref. We have not attached this ref to anything yet. So it knows that a ref is going to exist at some point, but we haven't attached it to anything. So we need to go back down to the input and say that this input is what we are referencing. So within here, we can add a JSX attribute called ref equals, and you'll need to these curly braces, hopefully you have a base level knowledge of JSX at this point. If not, I'm so sorry because I've probably confused the heck out of you. But the curly braces just means that we're going to be running JavaScript within this JSX. So this dot ref equals this dot, sorry, not this dot ref, just ref, the attribute itself equals this dot href. So now we've linked those two things up. We've told React that there's going to be a reference to a DOM element, and we've attached the reference to our input. Awesome. So I'm going to comment this out for now. We are going to need to set state here in a moment, but let's just confirm that our ref is working. The age input val, I'm going to comment that out too. We'll make a new variable or a new const, and we'll just call it age input L, the actual element. And that is going to need to reference the ref. So this dot age ref. Let's see what that gives us. When we click update age, it's telling us that this is undefined. And that is because in order to actually, within this method, get at the DOM element on the page, this is just a parameter of using refs. So when you're referencing that ref, you need to then tell it current. It's a property of the ref. Oh, you dirty liar. Ah, you know what it is? We have not bound this to our method. So here's a good lesson in React that happens to me all the time. I've created a method. We have not bound this to that method, and this is undefined. This means nothing right now. So we need to bind this to our method in order for React to understand that we are referencing this component. So in order to do that, this is just kind of how I like to arrange stuff within my constructor. There's no, I don't know if there's any like React sanctioned best practices for this, but I like to define, I kind of treat this as like a variable, right? This ref. So I like to define the variables up here towards the top, very much like I would define const this equals whatever. And then when we are binding methods, I like to put that at the bottom just because I kind of like to be able to, if there's a ton of stuff up here, just scroll up a little bit and see which methods I've bound and which ones I haven't, because you start writing your methods right after the constructor. So just an organizational thing that I like to do. Binding the method. So this dot, this dot update age. So we're referencing the method that we just wrote. This dot update age equals this dot update age, again referencing the thing that we just wrote, dot bind this. So now we're telling React what this is in the context of the method that we've just written. So const age input L, this dot age ref dot current. I am now going to console dot log age input L, and there we go. So now it outputs input type number. We actually get the element being output, and that's awesome. That's great. Really good. Cool. Let's see. Let's check my notes. Cool. So we've bound the method. We have defined the variable. We've referenced the DOM element. So now we can go through and actually update the state, right? So get rid of this console log. At this point, you have access to that element in the same way that you would with any other like JavaScript defined variable. You can do pretty much this. You can run any of the same methods that you would normally within JavaScript, right? So like if we wanted to get at the value or the class name or anything like that, you can do that within here. So we have need for the value. So instead of age input L, I'm going to set this back to age input val. And we will console log age input val. And see if I type in a number, we're now getting that number passed back to us. So that's perfect. The last step here is to just do what we were about to do with set state and reference age input val. Oh, that's a semicolon, not a comma. Perfect. Cool. So by default, because we defined 28 as the age by default, as soon as we change this to 21, hit update age, you'll see that it changes right there up at the top for you. That pretty much covers at least the basics, if you have a basic understanding of React and how to work with JSX a little bit and stuff like that. Yeah, you're now up and running with React. You have the ability to write this is one of the things that I definitely didn't have a lot of insight to when I first started building stuff in React, is like I didn't even, for the longest time, I thought that you could only write class components. Like, I didn't know about pure components. I didn't know the right times to use stateless functional components, all of that type of stuff. I just kind of started writing class components just because I thought that's how React worked. So this is one of those things that I wish someone would have had a video on or something like that in the beginning, or something that was easily accessible for me to be able to understand that there's a little bit of thought that needs to go into how you choose the types of React components that you build. Pure components have a lot to them, and I still, like I said, don't fully understand how they work, but I understand at least when to think about how to build a component when I might need a pure component or a stateless functional component. So I've at least got that ingrained in my head now. So hopefully what we've done here, even though it was, if you've been building React apps and stuff, this probably wasn't, I didn't just shatter your mind or anything like that, but hopefully this at least gives you a pretty decent start to building React apps and some of the intricacies involved. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna go ahead and end the video here. What I'm going to try to do is just keep going down the road of React stuff. We've done the basic legwork for understanding how the React app is at least initially set up, what these components are. I'm going to try to every week put out one of these videos and just kind of keep going down the line. So one of the things too, and again, this can be like fully dictated by the folks that watch this video. If you've watched, if you're in Twitch watching now, if you're on YouTube watching this later, whatever, like, you telling me what is helpful to learn as a next step will make this much more personalized to folks actually in this situation. So like, my natural next step thought is to like, cool, we have the basics. I can now, take a week or a month or whatever and just mess around with React and start understanding the concepts and stuff like that. But like, if I had an idea for an app in my head, I would want some help figuring out, okay, like how create React app is cool, but you mentioned all of these things about like server-side rendering and routing and all of that type of stuff. Like, I've done the research. There are many hard concepts to grasp or understand. And if you're like me and you're just a normal, like I'm just a front-end dev, like I'm not a super fancy person that has like a awesome full stack engineering title. Like if you have the capacity in your brain to understand both the front end and the back end, that's awesome, and you are a super valuable person to the development world. But like, that's not how my brain works. So as I'm going through these things, it has taken me a long time to grasp this stuff, to like fully understand and realize how this all works. So my natural next step would be to choose a stack for an application that I want to then push out into the world. So my next video next week is going to be about choosing that stack. So thinking about what an application needs. And I'm probably honestly not going to build anything next week or show any code or anything. It's just going to be like talking, right? Like, because you need to understand the build tools and what those build tools do. And there's a ton of options out there for different types of build tools. There's 1 million and one is made every week, right? Same thing goes for state management, routing, the data storage. If you use MySQL database, or if you want to use GraphQL, if you want to do server-side rendering or client-side rendering, what are the pros and cons of each one of those? Like, how should I handle testing? That type of stuff. That's what I'm going to try and at least just talk about next week. So if that interests you, great. I'll see you next week. But hopefully what we did here today is at least a good enough introduction to get you started on your own, exploring a little bit more and trying to figure things out so that you can progress a little bit. So yeah, thanks for watching, and hope to see you guys next week. Thanks.